The crystal chandeliers of the Beverly Hills Hilton's grand ballroom cast shimmering light across 500 of America's wealthiest and most influential people as they gathered for the annual Children's Hospital Foundation Gala. November 12, 1994. Al Pacino sat at table 7, wearing an impeccably tailored black tuxedo, surrounded by Hollywood producers, tech entrepreneurs, and oil executives who had paid $10,000 per plate to attend this prestigious fundraising event. At 54, he was no longer the hungry young actor from the Bronx, but in this room filled with people whose net worth could fund small countries, he still felt like an outsider looking in on a world where money was the only language that mattered. But tonight, that world was about to learn that some things couldn't be purchased at any price. The evening had proceeded with the familiar rhythm of high society charity events. A string quartet played classical music while guests networked over champagne and caviar. The auction had raised $2 million for pediatric cancer research through the sale of luxury vacations, rare artwork, and exclusive experiences that only the ultra-wealthy could afford. Everyone present understood they were participating in a carefully choreographed display of generosity that served the dual purpose of helping children and reinforcing their own social status. Al observed the ritual with fascination. These weren't just wealthy people, these were titans of industry, tech moguls, oil barons, and entertainment executives whose decisions shaped the global economy. They moved through the ballroom with the casual confidence of people who'd never encountered a problem that money couldn't solve, speaking in the coded language of private jets and Swiss accounts that marked them as members of an exclusive club. But the evening's carefully maintained atmosphere of civilized philanthropy was about to be shattered by a confrontation that would be remembered long after the last check was written. The trouble began during the evening's keynote address, when Marcus Thornfield took the stage to accept the foundation's humanitarian award. At 42, Thornfield was one of Silicon Valley's most successful venture capitalists, a man who turned a Harvard MBA and family connections into a $12 billion technology empire. His portfolio included stakes in every major tech company of the 1990s, and his Midas touch had made him the poster child for American capitalism at its most ruthless and effective. Thornfield commanded the podium with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, his silver hair perfectly styled, his custom Italian suit impeccable, his voice carrying the particular authority that came from controlling vast amounts of capital. When he spoke, markets moved. When he invested, companies succeeded. When he withdrew his support, entire industries could collapse. Ladies and gentlemen, Thornfield began, his voice amplified through the ballroom sound system, tonight we've proven once again that when America's job creators put their minds to something, we get results. $2 million raised in 3 hours, that's the power of free market capitalism applied to social good. The audience applauded politely, though several guests exchanged glances at Thornfield's characterization of charity as a business transaction. But let me tell you what really drives success in this country, Thornfield continued, his tone becoming more aggressive, more personal. It's not hope, it's not dreams, it's not artistic expression or cultural contribution. It's capital. It's the ability to write checks that solve problems. Al shifted slightly in his seat, sensing that this speech was heading somewhere uncomfortable. Money talks, ladies and gentlemen, Thornfield declared, his voice gaining strength. Money talks louder than politics, louder than ideology, and certainly louder than entertainment. In the end, everything and everyone in this room is here because someone with serious money decided to make it happen. The statement was provocative, reducing everyone present to servants of capital, but the audience remained politely attentive. This was the kind of blunt capitalism that many of them privately agreed with, even if they wouldn't express it so directly. Take our entertainment industry friends here tonight, Thornfield continued, his gaze sweeping across the tables where Hollywood executives and actors Saturday, wonderful people, tremendously talented, but let's be honest about the relationship. They create content, we fund it. They perform, we pay them. They need our capital to exist, not the other way around. Al's jaw tightened slightly as he recognized the direction this was heading. Thornfield wasn't just celebrating capitalism. He was establishing hierarchy, making it clear who he believed really mattered in this room. And that's not criticism, that's just economic reality, Thornfield said with mock diplomacy. Artists and actors serve an important function in our society. They entertain us, they distract us from the serious business of building wealth and creating jobs. But entertainment is ultimately a luxury product, purchased by people with real money to spend on non-essential goods. The insult was surgical, delivered with such polished charm that it took several seconds for its full impact to register. Thornfield had just reduced every creative person in the room to the level of luxury service providers, people whose work had no intrinsic value beyond what wealthy consumers were willing to pay for temporary distraction. Al remained perfectly still, but everyone at his table could sense that something was building beneath his composed exterior. "Now don't misunderstand me," Thornfield continued, his smile predatory. "I have tremendous respect for our entertainment friends. Take Al Pacino, for instance, sitting right there at table 7. Wonderful actor, truly gifted performer, has brought joy to millions of people around the world." The spotlight of attention suddenly focused on Al, who nodded politely but said nothing, his dark eyes never leaving Thornfield's face. But Al's success, like all success in this room, ultimately comes down to one simple truth: someone with money decided his work was worth purchasing. The studios wrote the checks, the audiences bought the tickets, and Al became rich and famous. Not because his work has any inherent value, but because people with disposable income were willing to pay for it. The analysis was devastating in its reductive logic. Thornfield was essentially arguing that artistic achievement was nothing more than successful marketing to consumers with excess capital. "That's the beauty of capitalism, folks," Thornfield said, building to his conclusion. "It cuts through all the romantic nonsense about art and culture and gets to what really matters: supply, demand, and the ability to generate profit. Money talks, everything else is just noise." The ballroom erupted in applause. Not enthusiastic, but polite, obligatory, the kind of response that wealthy people gave to speakers who said things they privately agreed with but wouldn't want quoted in the press. But as Thornfield stepped away from the podium, basking in the approval of 500 of America's most powerful people, he made one fatal error in judgment. He walked directly to Al Pacino's table. "Al," Thornfield said with exaggerated friendliness, extending his hand. "Hope you weren't offended by my little economic analysis up there. Nothing personal, just business reality." Al stood slowly, his movement controlled but carrying an undercurrent of building energy that made everyone at nearby tables suddenly more alert. "Marcus," Al said quietly, shaking the offered hand briefly, "that was quite a speech." "Well, I believe in telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable," Thornfield replied with the confident smile of someone who believed he'd just delivered a brilliant insight. "Money talks, art walks, that's just how the world works." Al's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, like a storm gathering on a distant horizon. "You know what, Marcus," Al said, his voice carrying easily through the now quiet ballroom, "I think you're absolutely right about one thing." Thornfield's smile widened, perhaps thinking he'd converted another romantic idealist to economic realism. "Money does talk," Al continued, his voice taking on the controlled intensity that had made him famous. "But tonight, I'd like to tell you exactly what your money has been saying." What Al said next wouldn't just silence Marcus Thornfield, it would redefine how everyone in that ballroom understood the relationship between wealth and worth. What Al said next wouldn't just silence Marcus Thornfield, it would redefine how everyone in that ballroom understood the relationship between wealth and worth. The grand ballroom had gone completely quiet, 500 of America's most powerful people sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Al remained standing beside his table, his presence somehow commanding the attention of every person in the room, while Thornfield waited with the confident expectation of someone who'd never been publicly challenged by anyone he considered a subordinate. "You want to know what your money says, Marcus?" Al asked, his voice carrying easily through the silent ballroom. "Your money says that $12 billion couldn't buy you the ability to move a single human being to tears. It couldn't purchase the skill to make someone feel less alone in their darkest moment. It couldn't acquire the talent to help audiences understand parts of themselves they'd never explored. The attack was immediate and surgical, delivered with such quiet conviction that several guests leaned forward despite themselves. This wasn't the defensive response Thornfield had expected from someone he just publicly dismissed as a paid entertainer. Your money says that despite owning stakes in companies that employ hundreds of thousands of people, you've never created anything that will be remembered beyond the next quarterly earnings report, Al continued, his voice gaining strength. It says that for all your talk about solving problems with capital, you've never actually solved a human problem, you've just moved money from one account to another. Thornfield's confident smile began to flicker as he realized this wasn't going to be the gracious acceptance of economic reality he'd anticipated. Now Al, I think you're misunderstanding Thornfield began, but Al wasn't finished. Let me tell you what my work says, Marcus, Al interrupted, his voice taking on the controlled power that had defined his greatest performances. When I played Michael Corleone, I didn't just memorize lines and hit my marks. I spent 2 years learning what it costs psychologically to choose family loyalty over moral principles. I explored how good men become monsters through the decisions they make under pressure. The ballroom was electric with tension now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than a celebrity disagreement. This was a fundamental clash between two different definitions of value and achievement. That work, that exploration of human darkness and complexity, has helped millions of people understand their own capacity for moral compromise. It's forced audiences to examine what they would sacrifice to protect the people they love. That's not entertainment, Marcus. That's education about the human condition. Al began moving around his table, not aggressively but with the controlled energy of a master teacher delivering the most important lesson of his career. When I played Frank Serpico, I didn't just put on a police uniform and practice looking honest. I spent months riding with undercover narcotics officers, learning what it costs to be the only clean cop in a corrupt system. I watched good men get threatened, transferred, and worse for refusing to compromise their principles. The silence in the ballroom was profound now, even the waitstaff having stopped their movement to listen. And that performance has inspired countless people to choose integrity over convenience, to stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous. Police academies still show that film to recruits because it demonstrates what real courage looks like. Can you say the same about any of your venture capital decisions? Thornfield's face had gone pale, perhaps beginning to understand that he'd awakened something far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. But you want to know what really separates us, Marcus? Al asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the silent ballroom. When I die, people will study Michael Corleone and Frank Serpico and Tony Montana to understand what it meant to be human in the 20th century. Film students will analyze those performances for decades, trying to understand how an actor can disappear completely into another person's psychology. Literature professors will use those characters to explore fundamental questions about power, corruption, and the American dream. Al paused, letting his words settle over the silent gathering like a judgment. But when you die, Marcus, your $12 billion will be distributed to heirs who didn't earn it, invested in companies run by people who never met you, and used to purchase things that will be forgotten within a generation. Your entire life's work will fit into a single line in Forbes magazine: he accumulated wealth. The devastation was complete, but Al had one more point to make, one that would ensure this moment was never forgotten by anyone present. You said money talks, but you're wrong about what it says, Al continued, his voice taking on a new quality that commanded absolute attention. Your money says that despite having every advantage, the best education, unlimited resources, access to any opportunity, you chose to spend your life moving numbers around spreadsheets instead of creating anything that actually matters to human beings. Al looked around the ballroom, taking in faces that were now watching him with something approaching reverence. My grandfather was a plasterer who came to America with $8 in his pocket. He spent 40 years laying plaster on walls, and when he died, he left behind something more valuable than any portfolio, a grandson who understood that real worth comes from what you contribute to the human experience, not what you accumulate in bank accounts. The room was so quiet that the sound of someone setting down a wine glass seemed unnaturally loud. You mock art as luxury entertainment for people with disposable income, Al said, his voice building to the kind of passionate intensity that had made him legendary. But art is what separates us from animals. It's what allows us to explore experiences we'll never have, to understand perspectives different from our own, to feel connected to people across cultures and centuries. Al stepped closer to Thornfield, who was now visibly uncomfortable but trapped in the spotlight of 500 pairs of eyes. When a single mother working 3 jobs watches Serpico and decides to report corruption at her workplace because she sees that one person can make a difference, that's not entertainment, Marcus. That's transformation. When a teenager struggling with family loyalty watches Michael Corleone and learns to recognize the warning signs of moral compromise. That's not distraction, that's education. The passion in Al's voice was undeniable, and even the most cynical venture capitalists in the room seemed moved by the conviction of his words. But here's what your money really says, Marcus, Al said, his voice taking on a tone of almost pity. It says that despite having every resource necessary to make a meaningful contribution to human civilization, you chose to be nothing more than a very successful accountant. Al straightened his bow tie with deliberate care, his movement controlled and dignified. So yes, money talks. But what it's saying about you is that you've spent your entire adult life confusing accumulation with achievement, confusing net worth with human worth, confusing the ability to purchase things with the ability to create things that matter. The silence that followed was profound and transformative. Marcus Thornfield stood speechless, his legendary quick thinking apparently deserting him for the first time in his career. The man who'd made billions by always having the right response to any market opportunity seemed genuinely at a loss for words. Ladies and gentlemen, Al said, addressing the entire ballroom, we're here tonight to raise money for children's cancer research. That's important work, necessary work, and I'm grateful to everyone who contributed. But let's not confuse writing checks with solving problems. Money can fund research, but it can't create the compassion that motivates researchers to work 16-hour days. It can't purchase the hope that keeps families fighting when treatment becomes unbearable. Al looked directly at Thornfield one final time. Thank you for the economic lesson, Marcus. It's been educational. I hope someday you'll understand the difference between having money and being worth something. With that, Al walked toward the ballroom's exit, leaving behind 500 people who had just witnessed the most powerful defense of artistic value in the history of American philanthropy. The silence lasted nearly 30 seconds before someone began to applaud, first one person, then another, until the entire room was giving Al a standing ovation that lasted over 4 minutes. Even Marcus Thornfield, still standing speechless beside table 7, found himself mechanically clapping along. Word of the confrontation spread through America's elite social circles within hours. By the next morning, every major society columnist was reporting on the Beverly Hills Gala incident, the night Al Pacino had redefined the relationship between money and meaning in front of the country's most powerful people. Marcus Thornfield never again made public comments dismissing artistic achievement, and privately told associates that his encounter with Al Pacino had forced him to reconsider what he wanted his legacy to be. He quietly began funding arts education programs, though he never spoke publicly about his change of perspective. Years later, when cultural historians studied the tension between capitalism and artistry in late 20th century America, Al's response to Thornfield would be cited as a defining moment, proof that some values couldn't be purchased at any price, and that the most important contributions to human civilization often came from people who chose meaning over money. The Beverly Hills Hilton's Grand Ballroom had hosted presidents and kings, but everyone present that night agreed they had witnessed something even rarer, a moment when accumulated wealth was forced to confront the limitations of its own philosophy, and found itself unable to purchase the one thing it needed most, respect for what it had chosen to become.